Air traffic controllers. Do you know one? Really, every pilot should know an air traffic controller or three. As time runs, we're going to have more and more dealing with these folks, and it really helps the relationship to meet and talk with them. A more complex engine, whether turbocharged or just of more horsepower, requires more loving care and understanding than the four-bangers that power most of the trainers. By the time you get to the most powerful turbocharged engines, you are indeed dealing with a temperamental machine, one that will serve you well and faithfully only if you treat it correctly. That well and faithfully business takes on new meaning when the airplane's used for instrument flying. If ever you would fly with a pilot who slams the throttle in or yanks it back, you're flying with a pilot who makes engines unreliable. Having sloppily folded chart books or charts flopping around the cockpit like a bunch of fresh-caught fish just isn't the way to do it. I always thought that a pilot's organization skills are reflected by the condition of the cockpit after the airplane is parked. If it looks like the pilot was getting ready to wallpaper the inside of the airplane with en route charts, it's probably time to neaten up. Is there such a thing as an all-weather airplane? The answer is a resounding no. At a busy place, you'll be constantly reminded that saying your message in as few words as possible is a real piloting virtue, one that convinces everyone that you do indeed have the right stuff, the right stuff, the right stuff, the right stuff.
Well, you've probably heard by now, a whole bunch of heavy stuff's happened recently in the industry. We had a death on a major air carrier, we had a collegiate plane crash that never should have happened, and, well, one of the aviation greats passed away recently. So I want to dedicate this episode to the now late Richard Collins. If you're listening to this podcast in the USA, I'd be really surprised if you aren't a regular reader of Flying Magazine. And that, of course, has a lot to do with Richard Collins. Obviously, all of the aviation publications out there have covered this, but I want to share the article that Flying Magazine put out on their website for obvious reasons. The headline is, "Former Flying Editor-in-Chief Richard Collins Dies." The one-of-a-kind writer and pilot left an indelible mark on the world of aviation publishing. By Stephen Pope, May 1st, 2018. Richard L. Dick Collins, a prolific aviation journalist whose career spans 60 years, nearly half of it on the masthead of Flying Magazine, including more than a decade in the 70s through the late 80s as editor-in-chief, died on Sunday at his home in suburban Maryland. He was 84. Born on November 28, 1933, Collins wrote his first aviation article in 1947 when he was just 13 years old for Airfacts, his father, Leighton Collins' magazine. He joined the staff of that publication full-time in 1958 after serving a time in the U.S. Army, and as chief pilot for the Ben M. Hogan Company, which was a highway construction company based in Little Rock, Arkansas. That first article was Collins' personal account of piloting an Air Coupe, at the time, a relatively new light general aviation airplane. He would go on to earn his pilot's license a few years later, stirring an inexhaustible enthusiasm for flying that continued for the next 57 years as he amassed 20,000 hours in the air, many of them famously at the controls of his Cessna P210, which he wrote about often in the pages of Flying. He voluntarily hung up his wings for good at age 74, but continued to author blog posts for Airfacts Journal, an online publication he helped create in 2011. Quick sidebar, if you aren't reading Airfacts Journal, you need to. Go subscribe, there's a link in the show notes, and of course on the blog post associated with this episode on podcastingonaplane.com. Anyway, back to the article. Collins joined the staff of Flying in 1968, rising to become its 10th editor-in-chief in 1977, and remaining with the magazine until 1988. He then spent 2 years as editor-in-chief and publisher of AOPA Pilot, the magazine of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. He returned to Flying as editor-at-large with a cover blurb on the November 1993 issue proclaiming, "Richard Collins is back on top." It was a play on the title of his On Top column, in which he ruminated on the safety issues of the day in his folksy, plain-spoken style, never shying away from controversy or the chance to make his audience think more deeply about their own flying. Through his career, he wrote thousands of magazine articles and columns, authored numerous books on weather flying, air traffic control, and flight safety. He created educational videos and penned occasional touching personal stories about his wife, Ann Slocum Collins, who died in 2012, and, of course, their 3 children. And again, that article from Flying Magazine. You know, from a personal perspective, it always sucks when somebody flies west, but I've really been bumming since I found out. And why does this one get to me so much? Well, although we never met, I always considered him to be a mentor, somebody I wanted to model my aviation behavior after. I always thought it was cool that even though he was grandfatherly age relative to me, he was sharp, he was proficient, and he was always getting better. He wasn't one of those guys that just paid lip service to the effort while mostly just letting the skills decline, doing the same things they've always done. He genuinely stayed on point. I literally grew up reading Dick Collins' era Flying Magazine. But what was it about his writing style that appealed to barely teenage me? I mean, that wasn't what most other kids my age were reading, assuming they were reading anything at all. It was that he was a great communicator. And for some reason, people who are great communicators always strike a chord with me, especially when they have a cool accent. In the days before podcasting, a little part of me wanted to be an aviation writer. It was hard to envision myself really ever being as good as Dick or his father, the late great Leighton Collins, or Gordon Baxter, or any of the other greats who wrote about aviation back in the day. But if I had a do-over on some part of life, I might go back and rethink that writing thing. Well, now we have podcasts and digital format magazines. It's a whole different world. But despite that, I like to think that myself and the other current generation of aviation podcasters and writers, videographers, vloggers, we all share some of that same spirit of communication that was shared by the Collins duo. And we all collectively owe them a lot for paving the way to where we are now. Stop and think about it for a minute. Dick Collins was pretty much the OG aviation vlogger, and I hope we all learned something. As a CFI, I always struggled, to some degree with the idea of how to teach the student who isn't even slightly interested in a professional flying career to approach a flight with some level of professionalism. It was like the second you mentioned that word, that non-professional track student, their mind would just shut down. But that person was probably going to buy something complicated and fast to fly for themselves. So I had to find out a way to show that student a way to act. I needed to find a type of personality that would resonate with them. Well, Dick was just that person. He was a well-to-do, creative guy, a straight-shooting aircraft owner who wants to get all the utility possible out of their personal aircraft. And that was the ticket. If somebody didn't want to hear a lesson from 20-something me, go-getter future airline pilot kid, well, that's fine. But they were usually persuaded by Mr. Collins. And that's fine with me. As far as I'm concerned, if all GA pilots approached light aircraft flying with the same attitude that Dick did, general aviation would be a much better, safer place, and a more rewarding place for all of us. It was often said that he always flew his P210 around like a little mini airliner. And I heard that early in my flying career, and it really stuck with me, because I think the attitude that he had when he approached a flight was really something to model. If you want to see it for yourself, go check out some of those videos he did with Sporties back in the 90s. One of my favorites, he flies his P210 from Ohio to DCA, Washington National, and they film the whole thing. Anyway, that link is in the show notes for that one. Go check it out. At work, I always hoped to have the chance to talk to 40RC someday, but the timing was just off. He got rid of it and stopped flying right around the time my ATC career started. But man, that would have been cool. Anyway, I'm going to miss him and his writing a lot. So long, Mr. Collins.
Takeoffs are really a lot of fun. You start up on the power and the airplane starts accelerating. It's a very dynamic event. When you get up to liftoff speed and put a little aft elevator in there and the nose wheel lifts off and then the main wheels rumble for a second and then the airplane flies away, that's just one of the purest moments of flight.